welcome to the next episode of Recruitment Revolution. I am delighted to be joined today by Naomi Thompson. Now, Naomi and I have known each other for probably, I would say, maybe 15 years now. Yeah. I know Naomi from a number of different businesses that she's worked in the past, and then more recently, you've taken the leap of faith and set up your own business, Odel Solutions. So I will let you talk more about kind of why you've set up your business, and then we can kind of jump into today's podcast. So over to you, Naomi.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for having me on. It's a privilege to be here. So I'm Naomi Thompson. I am director and founder of Odel Solutions. So my background, I actually started in finance. I started my career as a trainee accountant, which is hilarious when you think about who I am now, because it's one part of my business that I don't enjoy doing. I've got a very good accountant now. So I moved across into HR, spent a few years in HR is when we first met. I kind of, probably the story will come out later, but yeah, fell out of love a little bit with HR. So found my way into business change, did a few roles in business change, and then I came back into HR, but with more of an OD slant about 10 years ago, and realised that OD is the whole that, that my kind of skill set sits nicely into. So I've spent the last 10 years doing a lot of OD work, a lot of OD qualifications, and kind of really researching the subject. So the difference between HR and OD is HR is sort of focused on the individual, the people, and OD is more focused on the organisation. So how can you align your people to your organisation through the strategy? And that takes form in lots of different types of activity, which is, again, the reason why I absolutely love it, because it's so varied. But typical work that I will do is I'll come into an organisation and do some cultural diagnostics. I'll help them understand, what does their culture look like versus what their intentional culture they want to have. We'll then set about helping them with things like strategies, people and culture strategies, capability strategies, strategic workforce planning, all the kind of, there's a raft of things that can happen for them to try and get from where they are to where they need to be. And again, applying sort of change management practices to help them to get where they need to be. And it's hard work. Cultural change is slow. It's interesting. It's fascinating, and multifaceted. But that's kind of the reason why I set up my organisation, because as much as I love doing it internally, I really wanted to make a bigger difference. And I think that through Odel Solutions, I can reach out and spend more time with leaders, helping them get more effectiveness out of their organisations and their people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where you and I kind of align quite a lot, because it's very much about how do these businesses retain the top talent? How do they recruit the top talent? And how do you become an employer of choice? And I think, focusing on OD, organisational design, and culture and people, it's all linked together. And I think businesses in the area may be doing it without knowing they're doing it. They might not have that OD kind of tag on it. But I think the purpose of today, is to sort of let people know what they should and shouldn't be doing, but also to maybe make them think that actually they're doing a really good job already. They just didn't know that that's what they were doing, but giving them some nice little hints and tips of things that they can take away after today's podcast. So I think probably the first thing for us to do is actually explain what OD is. So OD is organisational design, but how does that translate to everybody listening? Explain what that means.
Yeah, it's good. It's a really good point, because OD, it can be a function. Typically large organisations have OD as a function, and OD is organisation development and design, and they're both interchangeable. But it's also a mindset, so you can be a really strategic person with an OD mindset, and it's about looking at the organisation as almost like a living organisation, like a living entity that has lots of different parts to it. So when you're coming up with a challenge or you're coming up against, you know, a bit of resistance in the organisation, it's about looking at that entire living organism to say, actually, where's this coming from? And what I see typically is a lot of organisations, they know they've got a problem and they'll see the symptoms of that problem. So an example might be, they might say, you know, our managers don't take any accountability. And they go, that's the problem. The symptom is our managers are not asking enough questions, they're not leading things, change through, taking accountability for that. So what we need to do is we need to bring in a training program. I'm going to teach all of our managers accountability. And that really is an example of treating the symptom rather than getting to the root cause. So if you step back with an OD mindset, looking at the organisation design of your business, there could be multiple things that are going on. For example, it could come back to things like the RACI, the responsibility, the accountability, you know, the job design. Do managers really know what they're accountable for? It could be misalignment of functions. It could be all kinds of reasons, you know, absence of frameworks. There could be a blame culture, so managers don't take accountability because when they make a mistake, you know, there's all sorts of reasons why that is happening. But what tends to happen is we throw training at the problem and it might slightly improve it for a period of time. It might make the situation worse because managers then feel that they've got these new skills and tools, but they're still resisting against the organisation. So by having this mindset and thinking about how can I actually look at all these different facets? What's going on in the strategy? What's going on in the culture? What are my processes telling me? What's the business telling me? What are the things that people can see? You know, that builds a whole different picture where you can really lead transformational change. Like I said at the beginning, it's slower, but it's sustainable, and it makes that difference between your change being a short, quick win that gets forgotten about or something that's actually becomes a sustained part of your culture. So yeah,
I think that's important as well, because, you know, when I work with business leaders on how to change internally, it's quite often some of them want, well, what's a quick win? How do I, you know, I've got a retention issue. How do I solve that problem? You know, people leaving is a symptom. It's finding out, like you say, well, what is the cause? What's going on to make your turnover quite big? And, you know, and I've had conversations with business leaders before where they go, well, we do an exit interview. And actually everybody's reason for leaving is different. So I don't think it's us. I think, you know, and you go, yeah, but actually for me, you have to kind of, like you've just said, delve a bit deeper into this, because they might be telling you that's why they're leaving, but what's going on to prompt them? You know, somebody's going traveling. Yeah, but what's happened to make them want to go traveling?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, they're relocating. Yeah, but that's not a decision that they've made overnight. Or, you know, they're going to do something completely different. And, you know, and I think as well, you and I have both left jobs, you know, we're of an age now where we've had a number of different jobs over our careers. And you are not necessarily always honest to tell people why you're leaving. You sort of tell them what you think they want to hear, but it's not necessarily the truth. And I think for me, that's one of the key things that I think this can really benefit businesses, is where they go, you know, I've got a turnover that I need to investigate why that's happening. Or like you say, I've got managers that won't take accountability. I've got a disengaged workforce, or, you know, it's all these different things that you've really got to kind of take all them steps back to identify, well, what's the root cause of this challenge and why is it happening? And then actually, well, what can we do to change it? Absolutely. And I always say to a business, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day. There are no quick wins in this situation. It's going to take time, and you've got to invest the time to change mindset, to change opinion, to change your culture.
Absolutely. And with that said, again, I've facilitated a lot of discussions with teams around where we've created things like listening circles and tried to get feedback mechanisms. And sometimes it's really simple things that can make quite a big difference. I remember working with a team where they'd had a relatively new leader come in, and this leader would come in on a morning and not say good morning. It was that simple. And it really made them feel that there was a us and them scenario going on, that this leader couldn't even take a second to say good morning. And the impact that had was so significant that it kind of created this sort of distrust in the office. And sitting down that leader to say, why don't you say good morning to them on a morning? And they said, oh, and it was absolutely right. They're coming on a morning, they're probably like all of us, they've done a drop off at nursery, they've come in, they're trying to get themselves into their work mindset. And then they're just thinking, right, I've got to get into my office because I've got a call in 6 minutes. If I say morning, someone might stop me and ask me a question, and what am I going to do? And it's like, well, actually, if they do that, what could you say? Oh, well, I've got a call now, but let me come back and chat with you in a bit. Like, that's not the end of the world. And there's some of these things that are really, really easy. But your point about surveys is so right. Surveys play a huge part in measuring, how people feel about your culture, how people feel about their jobs. But you've got to ask the right questions. And if you're not asking the right questions, the data's useless. It's absolutely useless. And because we work in such a complex environment now, we need to be really thinking about what's going on in our organisations. Because if you're using the same surveys that we were using 2 years ago, you're getting it wrong. Because, I think there's a recent report that's come out around, I'm trying to think now, they call it the communication inflation, where we're talking about like 88% of the workforce are communicating across functions, which is probably 4 times more than we were 10 years ago. The fact that we're using different channels, the complexity that comes in for employees now and how they get their work done is completely different to how it was 2 years ago. So, the introduction of things like AI. So you have to be constantly evolving the questions that you ask to really understand what's going on.
And I think as well, that sort of ties in with, and what sort of, I think we're going to keep kind of coming back to managers, because I think this is a leadership piece. How people like to be communicated with. So I think as a business, you have all these different channels that your employees need to communicate across the business with stakeholders, with customers, whatever it might be. But how often do leaders ask their teams how they want to be communicated with? It quite often is an assumption that if I send an email to everybody, I've told them. Or, we've got an intranet, so if I put it on the intranet, everybody knows. And and I've worked with, manufacturing businesses where 2/3 of the workforce are on a shop floor with no access to a computer. So if you're emailing them or putting something on an intranet, or you want them to do some online training, when do they do that?
Absolutely. And we know that we've all got different preferences as well. I have another business that I have with a business partner, Louise, and we run sort of behavioural insights. We work with high performance leadership teams with that key premise around everybody has got a different communication preference. Some people like to read things, some people and reflect, some people like to have an active conversation, and but some of us just want to reflect and contribute differently to others. So we have to adapt our communication skills. And I think me and you have had these conversations. I think leaders get a really hard press, and I think the role of the leader has significantly changed, more so than the pandemic than ever. If you look back over kind of the number of years I've been in work and being a leader, that we encourage our employees to bring their whole selves to work. So that can unpack all kinds of things in the office that we didn't historically talk about at work, rightly or wrongly. And, coming back to what I talked about, the complexities of multi-channels, multi-communications, multifunctional workshops that are going on, strategy, competitiveness, every business is facing more competitive challenges than ever. And the leaders, we expect them to do more and do more and do more and do more. But again, coming back to the organisation design, when was the last time we actually looked at the role of the leader? We looked at, how much capacity have they got to lead? How much of their expertise is required to be in the job, in the do, and how much is in the lead? And have we looked at their spans of control? Have we looked at, have they got enough remit to be able to learn all these new behaviours that require them as leaders, and what resources have we given them? And it's not surprising that we're seeing more manager burnout more than ever. It's absolutely prevalent, manager burnout. And I know a lot of people in a lot of businesses, and a lot of people are kind of living for the weekend. They're just sort of climbing their ways to Fridays because they've got this burnout that's going on with the constant communications. And we hear people use the term, I just feel peopled out. Because if you think back to how we were working 10-15 years ago, we probably didn't speak to many colleagues, probably spoke to more customers on the phone. But now it's that sort of in the moment, constant real-time conversations, like problem solving. How do we fix this problem? Change has got to happen. We've got to get this implemented by the end of the week. And leaders, play a huge part in that. And I don't think we do enough. And I say this from empathy, because we're all in that same boat. We're all just trying to hold on. But we don't do enough to look at the job design, particularly when we're incorporating new managers. What's the span of control of that manager? What type of decisions do we ask them to make? Where's the bandwidth of their decision making? Coming back to that very first problem we talked about around accountability, do they know what they're accountable for? So we do set them up to fail, and that is a really tough path for them to navigate.
And I think there's a lot there as well, because you and I know there's a big piece on accidental managers. I saw it time and time again in the business that I worked in, where you are promoted to be a manager because you're really good at your job, but it doesn't make you a good people manager.
Yeah.
And actually, like you say, if they don't look at the job design and they go, you're really, really good at your job and you're hitting all these targets, and we now want you to manage a team of 5, but we haven't changed the remit of you doing the day-to-day work as well. You've just got to now find time to fit in the management stuff, the training stuff, the mentoring, the coaching, the one-to-ones, the performance reviews, but we're still expecting you to do your full-time job around all of that. And you go, well, why do you not invest in your people and go, actually, what we're going to do to make you a good manager, we're going to, like you say, reorganize that role, and maybe 2/3 of what you're doing day to day is your job, but the other third of your time is your management time. And what we're going to do is invest in training and development as well, so that you can be the best manager that you can be. Or go right back to the beginning and go, do you actually want to be a manager? Just because you're good at your job doesn't mean that you want to. Some people, it's just thrust upon them, or somebody leaves and it's all right, you can step up then, or you get family members coming into family run businesses who become managers because you're the daughter, the niece, the brother of whoever owns it, and it's like, oh, come in and be that manager because I trust you because we're related. And I think there's a lot of challenges, and I think you're right, managers do get a bad press. Having been a manager myself, and you have as well, you shoulder a lot because you're kind of stuck in the middle. You've got the people below you, and then you've got the people above you, and everybody wants a piece of you. And it's a difficult position to be in, and that kind of manager burnout, it's a real thing. I've seen it for years. And it's how do businesses kind of deal with that? What should we be doing as business owners and business leaders when we've got managers in our team? What do we do around that kind of job design? What would you say are kind of the best bits of advice you can give?
I think the first thing is looking at this. I'd look beyond the person. I'd look at the role. Businesses have a really good way of chunking down management types into what kind of role it is, and it gives you a really good indication of things like how much how much capacity have they got to manage a team? What type of specialism is it? So if it's somebody who's like, I'm going to pick an accountant for an example, it's a highly skilled job. So if you've got somebody who's managing a group of accountants, they're going to have an accountancy background, and they're going to be very much in the, probably more the strategic do, but they're going to be in the do. So the spans of control for that individual need to be quite small. So they can't really have any more than 3 or 4 direct reports. Anything more than that, they can't manage that sort of balance. And then it kind of works its way all the way to kind of the coordinator, the facilitator. Call centres, a great example, you know, highly standardised process. People come in, they get trained probably separately by a different team, coming into the contact centre role, and those managers wouldn't take calls. Their job is around motivating, coaching and leading that team. So they could have up to 12, 15 direct reports. So it's looking at what is the role, what is required of that person, and making sure that the spans of control work well in that job design. And actually, if it's somebody is an internal promotion, you know, what do we sit with them and explain? How do we take that away? And what often we do is we throw them onto a leadership development program, which is great because it helps them understand the differences around that sort of transaction analysis. What's the difference between a manager and a leader? You know, how to delegate. But we don't actually spend some time with a job design saying, well, actually, we're going to take this off your job description, we're going to pass it down. So you see that sort of transactional piece of you don't do that anymore. And again, we're humans. So when we're going through change, we hold on to what's comfortable for us. So when managers are stepping into promotions, we just, our human behaviour tells us to hold on to the stuff that we know that we're good at, because we're going through this kind of consciously incompetent process where we're doing some new stuff. And there's other things that are creeping in, like imposter syndrome. All of a sudden you're managing your mates, you know, people that you've been colleagues with. There's all sorts of stuff that's going around. So we have to really, you know, I don't really like the term accidental manager because it puts the blame on the manager. The blame's on the organisation or the hiring manager who hasn't done enough to support that individual. Because again, you know, people, one of the things that you see is a lot, particularly in the organisations I've worked in, the only way to get promoted and get more money and get more equity in your job title, so you can put it on LinkedIn and celebrate down at the pub with your mates, is by getting a management role. There's not many kind of non-leadership roles that people then can aspire to. There are some in bigger organisations who are really good at talent mobility, but in smaller organisations, that's probably the only really clear step to earning more money and getting promoted, which is what, you know, most people wanting to achieve in their careers.
And I think that it's also having that conversation, because in, you know, working in recruitment, one of the good things about working in recruitment is you can progress without being a manager. So in the industry that I'm in, there's always 2 routes. So if you want to be a people manager, you can go down that route. But if you don't and you want to stay just recruiting, you can go down that route. But you can be the same level. So, you know, you could get up to being a director, but one's a business director and one's a people director.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to potentially be more of that, and looking at that reward and recognition of your people. So if they don't want to manage staff, can you still look at extra scope, extra things for them to do, extra responsibility, so they can still have that personal development and that progression without them having to go into that default management role? Because if they don't want to do it or they're not very good at it, you then run the risk of losing them. Whether that be that you performance manage them out because they're not a good manager and actually the workers kind of, the capability's gone down, or they leave because they're not enjoying working for you anymore. So, you know, there's definitely this kind of job design thing, I think, is something that not many businesses think about. They just go through that, oh, you can do this now and you can do that now, or we've created this for you because we want to reward you. And people do it with the best intentions, don't they?
Of course they do. Yeah,
best intentions. I want to reward you, so I've created this management role, or so and so's left and I want to reward you because you've been here for 5 years, so I think you should step up into that. But employees don't really say no very often, do they? Because they don't want it to go against them. So they'll say yes, whether they want to do it or not, because they feel like they should. So I think, you know, as a business leader, looking at that job design and going, if we're going to speak to this person about it, have a collaborative conversation, and then actually look at, well, what capacity have they got to continue doing their job and taking on management of X amount of people. And like you said, actually, is there too many people to manage? You know,
Yes.
dependent on what
Yeah.
role they're going into. Like you say, an accountant, you should only have a few people, but in a contact centre, absolutely, you can manage a lot, because that is a pure management role. You know, I've always had teams of maybe 4 or 5, because I've been doing my job and managing, and that's a lot, because it's you know, you've got to fight fires and solve problems all day, every day. But if I had to do that day job and manage a team of 15, well, I wouldn't be doing my day job.
Yeah. Well, you just can't. Like, you would just burn out.
Yeah.
100%. And you wouldn't be there for everybody. That's the challenge, isn't it? It's about your role with 15 direct reports is about coaching, leading, setting the vision, supporting them. You should not be doing any of the doing it with 15 direct reports, or you're not doing that thing. You know, they're not getting their one-to-ones, they're not getting their career progression.
Yeah.
I think coming back to, you know, when we're recruiting these managers, you know, yeah, great. If they've reached the top of their competence in that particular technical skill, that's a really good place to start. But there's still a whole raft of other things that you have to be considering first. And, you know, for me, the first point is around that growth mindset. You know, have they got the willingness to become self-aware, to put the work in, to be the best leader that they can be? Because I think, you know, leadership's a privilege. You know, the ripple effect of leadership is so profound. I think there's some research around the relationship you have with your manager has 7 times more impact than the people who you love, your medical practitioners. You know, and we all know, we've all known someone, or we've all been managed by somebody, and it's affected, you know, our confidence, it's affected our mental health, it's, you know, all of these things apply. You know, and they say people don't leave companies, they leave managers. So there's a lot of responsibility as a leader to be the best that you can be. It starts with self-awareness, but you have to have that growth mindset first to be able to step into that. And then being adaptive, you know, sort of being able to think on your feet, being able to adapt to the people in your team, to their different communication styles, to their preferences. And I think once you've got somebody that has shown you those skills, then there's so much more that you can do with that individual. Whereas if you've got somebody who's gone, you know, like you say, has been given this role, they've taken the money, and not always, you know, I know people that have stepped into managerial roles and ended up being worse off because they lose out on overtime or shift bonuses and things like that. So they've done it as a career progression thing. But, you know, it comes with a lot of responsibility. You know, you wouldn't go into the gym and lift, you know, 80-kilo weights without training for it. So, you know, managing a team of 5 people and being responsible for their sort of job purpose, for their job engagement, their business engagement, why would you do that without any training or any development? You just wouldn't, you shouldn't, you know. And if that's the sort of mindset that you've got, then you definitely shouldn't be in a leadership role.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think it is, I think you're right with that growth piece as well. I think being a leader and wanting to be the best leader it's really, really important. And like you say, it's a difficult job to be in, because actually you get criticised a lot. So being able to kind of feel that you are personally ready to take on that journey, and that your senior leadership team above you are there to support you in that. You know, I think you can't just sort of throw somebody into that role and go, I'm sure you're going to be fine. Because like you say, you can't be effective, you can't be the best leader that you can be without support, without a circle of people around you to help you and guide you. And if your senior leadership team don't support you, and then you know, you're then not the best leader to your people, it can kind of come crashing down. So there's a lot of really, really key things there. And I think you're absolutely right in what you said, and that capacity to be adaptable and fight fires and problem solve and be able to think on your feet are, you know, they're vital. You know, they're really, really vital, because people look up to you for those answers. You know, your team will go, I've got this situation, how do I handle it? And it's being able to either push back to them to go, how do you think you should handle it? Or if they
Perfect.
genuinely have got no idea because they're a new starter, how do you show them and coach them and develop them to learn so that next time it happens, they know what to do? So, you know, it takes a lot of kind of thinking quickly in a split second to go, how am I dealing with this situation? Do I need to take over? Do I need to push back? Am I spending time with them? And actually, that comes from your business investing in you as a leader so that you can deal with those situations, and then somebody else who might be kicking off, and you've got to juggle, haven't you, and spin them plates. That's the thing for this. And I think the sort of, when we're talking about leaders, I think one of the most important things is kind of when you have new starters coming in. So what kind of leader are you when you have a new starter coming in? Because their first opinion of the culture and the business is you, especially if you've done the interview as well.
Yeah, 100%. I always say that your new starters, they're like the golden syrup of the organisation in terms of they know what it's like. They know they can articulate what your culture's like. And I always think around about day 30, between sort of day 30 and day 45 is a really good time to, you know, in organisations I've worked in, we've run focus groups, we've asked them questions around, you know, what was the recruitment process like? What was the training induction like? You know, and again, it can be very different for different parts of the organisations. And you know, they will tell you what the sort of insights into what it feels like to work in your culture, because by the time you get to about day 90, they become native. They become part of the culture, if that makes sense. So I think that is a really, really important time to sort of speak to to really understand what it feels like to work in your business and what it feels like to work under the managers. Yeah, absolutely. So that's, again, coming back to the surveys, asking the right questions, but asking the question or creating a forum for them, making sure that they've got access to, you know, what you're talking about then is around knowing when to coach and when to mentor. And for me, the gap is around the bit in the middle is the knowledge. Who's got the knowledge? If they can't possibly have the knowledge, you're mentoring them. If it's a question where they just haven't got confidence, or, you know, that's coaching. And so you're kind of doing more mentoring in the first instance, but you know, who is their mentor? Who is their work buddy? Like, who have they got in the organisation that they can ask all these? And even more so, and again, in the typical organisations I work with, hybrid, you know, new starters, there's loads of research around new starters and about the knowledge loss that they have because they're remote working or their managers are not in the office. And I think, you know, I've got all kinds of opinions about hybrid work, and it's a bit of a sweet spot of mine because I did my MBA dissertation on it. So I've got a lot to say about hybrid. But I do think, you know, whichever side of the coin that you're on, new starters need a lot of focus, because when they're at home remote working and they're dealing with something that they could be just quickly asking a question, you know, what barriers are you moving out of their way to make sure that they can integrate into your culture as quickly as they possibly can?
And I think I use this fact a lot. In the current climate, your sort of Gen Zs and the up and coming alphas are currently thinking about another job within 72 hours of starting your job. And the reason for that is because you've not embedded them in the culture. So, you know, if you've got them working from home and they're new, no, they're not embedded in the culture. You're probably doing online training, webinars and death by PowerPoint and inductions and stuff, because you're like, oh, I'm ticking the box, they've got to do all of this. But actually, is that the right thing to be doing on those days? Or is you know, can you make your induction and training a bit longer and vary it and do different things? And I think you're right with the work buddy. I think that's really important, giving them somebody internally that's not you that they can speak to and sound off and ask opinions and things, because no new starter in the world is going to be honest with the manager from day one. And I know that because every person we place in a job, we have to care for 3 months with the hiring manager, but also the candidate. And the reason that we do that is because if somebody's going to leave, it's within the first 12 weeks. And the reasons that they leave are reasons that can be easily overcome. So we make a big effort to speak to the person we place in a job and also the hiring manager, because they don't talk to each other, because they're scared. So, you know, the hiring manager, I've had one instance, I had a client and they were like, oh, I don't think that the candidate's happy, so we'll have to start looking for somebody else. I was like, well, have you spoken to them? No, I can just tell. They just don't seem to be happy here. So can we start looking at re-recruiting? Right, okay. So then I spoke to the candidate and I was like, you know, how's it all going? Oh yeah, really, really good. There's a lot to learn. You know, but I'm trying to sort of take it in my stride, but I'm not sure the manager likes me. Right, okay. Have you spoken to them? No, but you know, in all honesty, if they don't, I don't think it's going to be for me moving forward. Right, okay. What we need to do is sit down and the pair of you need to talk to each other. So I orchestrated this meeting where they both sat down and the candidate was like, you know, I'm not sure that I fit in, you know, and this kind of thing. And the hiring manager was like, yeah, no, I think it's great. You're fab, blah, blah, blah. I just don't think you're enjoying it. And they're like, no, I am enjoying it. I just didn't think you liked me. And then, you know, lo and behold, they had it all out and it was like, oh, misunderstanding, everything was fine. 3 years later, the person was still with the company and had been promoted. But had I have not done that piece of aftercare, either the company would have exited the person or the candidate would have actually just left, because neither of them was being honest with each other, because they're scared of having that conversation because they're new. And I just think you've got to start from day one and set your stall out, and that honesty, that transparency, that communication piece, which we've talked about already, it is so vitally important from day one. Do not assume just because they've started that they are going to stay. You've got to work hard to keep them. And if you are a new manager, you've got to work doubly hard because you've probably never dealt with this before. If you're hiring a new manager, think about the pressure that person's going to be on coming into your business as a manager. They don't know the team, they don't know you, and you're going to throw everything on them. So that's going to be a challenge. So, you know, in the current climate, retention's a really, really big issue for people. And I always say to businesses, if you focus on your retention, the recruitment comes easier. Yeah. You know, that kind of cause and effect. You know, people go, I need to just keep recruiting. It's like, no, retain your people, because then your recruitment reduces. And then you can recruit better people because your retention's better. And, you know, it goes full circle. But I think people don't focus on the retention. They just focus on the recruitment, because actually that's the bit where you're spending the money and you can see the difference that it makes immediately. I've got a vacancy, I can put a bum on a seat, I've dealt with the problem. And it's no, that's not the problem. Your retention's the thing you've got to focus on. And then the recruitment actually will naturally become easier.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to that contracting, isn't it? It's that sort of, you know, for me, in the early days, I've got a new starter on my team. I've been making sure that I'd be formalising a check-in every week, but also making sure that they're really clear that they, you know, they can come and talk to me at any point. But I'll be spending some time asking them questions around, how do you like to be managed, or how have you been managed before? Because if they've come from an organisation where it, you know, they've been micromanaged or they've had very little empowerment, you know, then to come into my team would feel really bizarre for them. Like they would probably waver around a while, but without knowing that, I wouldn't know how, you know, that would feel for them. So we'd talk about, okay, so have you managed before? How do you like to be managed? What do you need from me? And what signs do I need to look out for if you're not necessarily feeling engaged? And how can we contract with each other to make sure that if you're having a bad day, we can talk about it rather than going home? Because there's nothing worse going home and festering, like, oh, I don't think the manager likes me. And if you can have that conversation really early on about giving them that permission to come and talk to you about it, I think permission's so important. Yeah. And that empowerment and accountability. And coming back to the retention, when you're sort of working with organisations, one of the things I always find really interesting, and coming back to the surveys, when we talk about engagement surveys, you know, engagement surveys serve a purpose. They're really good at what, you know, to be able to give you pulse checks. But again, if the questions are right, but you need to find other ways of listening to your employees, you know, through different forums, you know, And I think, you know, the people, particularly at the front line, doing what they do, you need to be really tapping into what is the one thing that we do around here that really frustrates you? You ask yourself, why do we do that? Because it gets lost in the kind of hierarchies. And, you know, I've always found like one of my favourite programmes used to be on years ago. It was Back to the Floor, where the CEO would go and he'd work in the factories or whatever, baffled, absolutely baffled at the way people were treated or the things that the company was asking them to do. That was always the theme of it, because it gets lost. So I think you've got to keep that feedback loop that's going on consistently for engagement. But one thing about engagement is we've all got a responsibility to be engaged as well. So, you know, one of the things I learned in a previous organisation around engagement. So one of my team told me that they fudge engagement scores. They fudge them. Because if they scored how they really felt, they ended up with a 32-point action plan. Wow. So you're giving us more work and we're already busy. So we don't want a 32-point engagement action plan because you're just giving us more work and we're not subscribing to that. So we overinflate the engagement scores. Wow. And you're like, wow, what a nugget of information. So again, when it comes to engagement, I suppose top tip is around keep it really simple. And I always work to the power of 3. So when you kind of running these engagement surveys or you're sat with your team, you can ask that question around what is the one thing that you can do that will improve your engagement? You know, what is the one thing that you need me to do to help improve your engagement? And what's the one thing, where do you need help from the organisation? And kind of run your engagement action plans in a really simple process, because you know, people can overinflate scores for a variety of reasons: fear of reprisals, fear of having to do more work, you know, and also because they're proud of the organisation, they want the organisation to have good scores. So you need to find out, you know, the qualitative stuff as well, like the feedback mechanisms around what does it really feel like to work around here. But, you know, I've seen organisations go from being kind of engaged into almost entitled, you know, where you said we did, you said we did, you said we did, and it's constant, where employees just want more and more and more. So you have to be able to find a way in the narrative to say, okay, what in the cost of what? So you want a new benefit. So what one of the benefits have you got now that is worthless to you? Because then we can remove that and we can replace it with somebody that's worth something. And actually, what are you going to do? Because let's face it, we all know, you know, I've been disengaged. You know, I have worked in organisations where I've felt disengaged, and sometimes that's been a motion for me to move on or say something or do something. And I've always been of the ilk where I'll go say something, but not everybody is in that culture or has the confidence to say it. So what happens is, and I've been there myself, where you almost end up creating toxic club. It's a bit like Fight Club. You know, no one talks about toxic club. You get into this sort of, you meet somebody at the water cooler or the photocopier and you're like, ugh, gosh, this has just happened. They're like, ugh, yeah. And all of a sudden you form this bond because you're both unhappy about something. So next time you're in the canteen having lunch together, and then you start mumping about other things. So then toxic club becomes, then other people get invited to toxic club. And it becomes a commonality that everybody has. And actually in all of that, everyone's got a responsibility to speak out if there's something that's not right. If you haven't got able to speak out to your manager, that's why you need the other feedback mechanisms, skip levels, anonymous surveys, you know, suggestion boxes. You need to have all these things to really understand what's going on in your culture, because you might have really high engagement scores, but because the manager's a bully, you know, that could be happening. So you have to find different ways of understanding what's going on. And like, you know, those toxic clubs that are going on in the organisation, you know, speak to them and find out, what do we need to do to engage with you? What do we need to do? Or do we need to help move you on? You know, is it no longer? And I think that was a big part of Benenden. I was there for 9 years. And when I came into the organisation, there was a lot of work to do around cultural change. It was very siloed, very traditional business, and it needed to change. Lots of employees were like, we don't want to be here anymore. There's too much change. You're always asking us to do these new engagement surveys, and we've got these new values and we don't know what it means, and it's not for me anymore. And you're like, that's okay. That is okay, because you know, we're going to help you move on, and then we're going to bring in fresh legs. And that kind of, you know, opportunity to refresh the organisation is a good thing. But it's knowing how to do that in a really empathetic, respectful way. I think that's really important too.
And I think that you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. I think a lot of businesses try and keep hold of people because they don't want to lose anybody.
Yeah.
And that toxic club is a great kind of term to use, because actually, and you've sort of said it as well with the entitled, you do see, and I see it all the time when I work with businesses, and the staff become really, really entitled, and you have those people who are just not happy regardless of what you do. And they are your toxic club people, but actually they're not happy because actually it's time for them to move on.
Yeah.
You could give them the world and they would still find an issue, because actually they need to find somewhere else. They need that change. You need that change, and they need that change. And they're probably in denial and haven't admitted it to themselves. So it's having the capacity to sit down and have an honest conversation with them to go, you know, do you actually want to be here anymore? Because if, you know, we've done everything and, you know, and you're still not happy. So is this what you want? And, you know, if you can't turn them around and get them out of that toxic club, then it is going, right, well, let me support you into finding something else. And it's not being afraid to do that, because actually, if you keep hold of those people, negativity breeds negativity. They're going to bring everybody into toxic club, and then you'll lose everybody. So it's easier actually in the long run to get rid of that one and turn everybody around and, you know, re-recruit a new person for that, than it is to lose half a dozen because they've all been brought into it. This person will probably stay, but you'll lose all the other people. So, you know, that's the thing that you need to think about. And actually, if we sort of spin it full circle, that job design could be one of the things to do with this person. You know, actually, do we need to, is this person doing something that they can't manage their workload because there's too much going on, and therefore that's why they're negative? So it doesn't matter what the culture's like, actually they're getting overwhelmed because of what you're expecting of them.
Yeah, or they don't feel that they've got a contribution to what's been expected of them as well. So you're asking me to do this, but it makes no sense to me. If you'd asked me, I'd have told you to do Y. And I think that's sometimes where people do become disengaged, is they lose the voice in the amount of change that's happening. So again, it's that, how do you buy them into the problem? How do you engage them to say, I really trust your opinion on this. We want to do this. This is the outcome. What do you suggest? And bringing them into the problem can really help engage with them. But you're right, I've seen individuals who just love toxic club. It feels nice. I'm going to hold on to this. You know, and it is that sort of, it comes back to that talent piece around, if you've got somebody that you think, oh, I don't want to lose them, you've got to start thinking a bit more strategically around, okay, what organisational knowledge have they got? What part of their job is critical? Are they a key person dependency? How can I start to de-risk this individual leaving this organisation? Because, you know, and I hear that a lot. We get people in the last couple of organisations I've worked in, not big organisation, and so, you know, they're getting to the top of the skill set, they're going to leave soon, there's nowhere for them to go. Okay, they're going to go, they're going to leave, and that's okay, because they're going to go and they're going to say good things about us because they've been developed to the top of the skill set. And you know what, maybe they'll go and they'll go do something else and they'll come back in an even more senior role, but they need to get some breadth of skills. What we have to focus on now is a recruitment strategy, a talent strategy around the hole that they're going to leave behind. So that's where your efforts should be, you know, making sure that they are well supported in that journey and making sure that you de-risk that hole that they're leaving behind.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I've got a client who they've changed the mindset on people leaving the business, and they actually call it graduating. So, and I love it. It's amazing. And so they've worked with their managers to have honest conversations with their teams to go, you know, if you are not happy and you want to leave for whatever reason that is, we will support you in that, because a job is not for life anymore. You do a job for a certain period of time and you either get promoted or you change internally, or you go, I've had my time here, I'm going to move on and do something else. And so this business have worked with the managers to go, well, how do we help this person graduate if that's what they want to do? And by graduating, they also then keep in touch with them afterwards, because if they want to come back, the door is then left open.
Yeah.
And like you say, they might kind of go and go, the grass isn't green, I kind of come back, or they might go do something else and come back in a very different role, but they can add more value when they come back. But I love this term of graduating, and it shows you that you can have a positive culture and people can leave your business and it's okay. That's fine, you know.
Absolutely.
I speak to people all the time and say, you know, most of us are stepping stones in somebody's career journey. You know, they're with you for a period of time and you are one part of their journey and their life. So why not make it a positive one? Instead of sitting there panicking, going, they're going to leave because, go, I know they're going to leave at some point, but I want to get the most out of them while they're here, and I'm going to invest in them while they're here. And you'll probably find they'll stay longer because you've done that. Whereas some businesses go, oh, I'm not investing in training and development because they're just going to leave and I'll have spent all that money on training and then they're going to leave and use it elsewhere. And it's like, no, they'll leave sooner if you don't invest.
Absolutely.
If you don't support them, you will lose them sooner. If you do all of that, you will probably have them longer because they love working with you, for you, with their people. And they leave when they're ready to leave, but that's okay.
And they leave saying really good things about your business. And that employer brand reputation is so important, you know. And again, it takes time, but when you've got people saying good things, especially after they've left, that really helps your recruitment strategies around people go, oh no, you get really well looked after there, you're skilled, you're given development budgets. And I think that's so crucial. You know, I always say it comes back to, you know, this Glassdoor, you know, Glassdoor's always really interesting for anybody in the HR profession because it's always sort of deemed as the place where people go, the keyboard warriors, but actually there's some merit in what you want people to be saying about you as an organisation. And it's like when you go on holiday, you look at the reviews and you think, okay, no one's really complaining about the quality of the service, they're not really complaining about the staff, you know, they're complaining about the fact that the bathroom's a bit small and, you know, they had a balcony that was overcast, you know, it's things that were really outside of their control. So you can see past all of the sort of nuances, but when you go onto Glassdoor and you're seeing, you know, bullying and, you know, the work developed and the work told how to train to do their jobs, there's some really big red flags in there where you think that's probably not an organisation that I want to get myself into.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think, you know, we're in a world of you can find anything out if you search for it. So, you know, and I've worked with businesses where, you know, they've had major retention issues. There's been all sorts of different things going on internally, but they have then said, can you come in and help us work on this? We want to change. We want to do it differently. And that's when you kind of go, okay, so the reviews and the social media and all that kind of stuff, it actually ends at a certain point and then you can see it improving. So you can see that they've changed their mindset. You can see that they've invested in looking internally at, and this sort of goes back to what we said at the very beginning, what's the cause? Instead of kind of treating the symptoms, they've gone, right, we want to identify and address the cause of what's been going on. And the businesses that do that, for me, are some of the best businesses to work for because they want to make it better. They want to change and they want to address everything. And they're willing to go on that journey for however long that takes. And like you said at the beginning, it is slow, but the reward at the end of it is absolutely worthwhile. There are no quick fixes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I've seen that. I saw that at Benenden. I saw that at CPP. You know, CPP went through a really, really difficult time. You know, the press absolutely obliterated that organisation, yet we were still able to recruit people because the intention of the organisation was about culture, about development, about, you know, I had the best years of my career after all of those, because if you wanted to be part of the solution and to part of a really successful change management piece, that's where you needed to be. And the right people saw that, you know, they could see past the press stuff that was going on about the organisation and see this is an organisation that wanted to change. And, you know, I always say I earned my stripes in that organisation because we went through so much change management, so much cultural change, you know, and it was difficult, but it was a group of people who are really passionate. And, you know, you don't always have to get so hung up on the brand, what's going on from a brand perspective. It's the employer brand when it comes to recruitment. You know, what is it that you're doing?
Yeah, and I say this to businesses all the time. Your brand to your customers is one thing, but your employer brand in the local community, for me, is something that
Yeah,
everybody doesn't focus on. And you know, one of the reasons we do this podcast is because all the people I speak to keep coming back to this. It's your employer brand. It's your employer
yeah,
brand. Do all of this and it will improve your employer brand. Because if John down the road doesn't know who you are, you can't recruit the right
yeah,
people. Your customers in China might think you're the best thing since sliced bread, but you're not
yeah,
recruiting them. You're recruiting John, who lives round the corner. So, you know,
yeah.
all of this is about improving your employer brand. Have a good retention. You've got to have turnover. You've got to, because anybody who says to me that, you know, they keep hold of the staff and the turnover is really, really low, well, they're not evolving and they're not
Exactly.
moving
Yeah,
forward and they're not adapting to changes and things like that. So, you know, there's a fine line between too low and too much, but it's accepting that turnover is good as long as it's the right level.
yeah,
Having a good employer brand, recruiting the right way, and retaining the right people.
hmm,
You know, and all of that I think does sort of stem from what you said about kind of the OD. It's about the organization. Your people need to be the right people and you need to support them. But the OD part of it, I think it sort of starts from there.
yeah,
You know, and for me, that's something that I think a lot of businesses either don't know to do, or they might be doing it, but they don't know that they're doing it and they've not put that
yeah,
OD stamp on it, or, you know, they've not looked at job design. They might have done it, but they've not thought
yeah,
strategically about, oh, this is what we're actually doing. You know,
yeah,
SME businesses, some of the best SMEs I've worked with don't necessarily have a HR person. It's the managing director that's doing it all, but they're doing amazing things.
yeah.
But those names for things aren't there. They're just instinctively just really, really good at this stuff.
Just really good at it.
Yeah.
Absolutely understand the impact that, culture has, leadership behaviours. That's a really strong indicator of a culture as well. It's not just what's stuck on the walls and what's sat in a reward platform or whatever. It's about how do things get done, how do decisions get made, how do people get treated. It's so important. And organisational alignment, we haven't talked about purpose, and I think that's probably the last point that I'll talk about.
Yeah.
Is the significant piece of work that we did at Benenden was around organisational clarity. It's about making sure that every single person in that organisation knew the part that they played in the overall purpose. And our purpose at Benenden was to improve the nation's health. I mean, how compelling is that? And we spent time making sure that everybody understood how the strategic objectives sort of cascaded into functional objectives, how they then went into team objectives, how they then went into individual objectives. So everybody knew the part that they played in the very important. So it's a really important part of that whole job fulfillment piece. When you're having a really difficult day, your tech's not been working properly and you've been stuck in the traffic on the way home from work or whatever, that purpose, that part that you've played in the big picture that's inspiring, is what gets you out of bed, what gets you into work and kind of wants you to work hard with your colleagues and do the right things for your customers. And I think that was a really big pivotal point of the cultural change piece that we did.
And I
Definitely
think
worth the investment of effort.
definitely. And, you know, in all honesty, one of the biggest reasons we get when people come to us to look for work is, I don't feel like what I'm doing makes a difference. I want to work somewhere where I feel like I'm making a difference. And that's not that they're going to be the new CEO. That can be an administrator or a receptionist or, you know, an accountant or whatever. But like you say, what part does their job play in the future growth aspirations, vision, mission, whatever you want to call it? Do they know that the part that they're playing in you getting there? Because if they don't, you need to be having that conversation with them. And that's one of the reasons people leave, is because they're not feeling valued. They don't feel like what they're doing makes a difference. And it absolutely does. But if they don't know that, then
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
cultural piece is missing.
And it's that sort of, we did a whole piece using appreciative inquiry where we got people to talk about the impact. So bringing to life through stories, which is so empowering, bringing to life stories about how their job has made a difference. And we did this whole workshop. People were in tears. It was because it was so moving when all of a sudden you've got people and they might be doing a really transactional admin task, but that transactional admin task might be the pathway between getting somebody the healthcare that they needed, you know, a really important journey that was going to get them out of pain. And when you start putting the narrative around what is fundamentally processing a form, that is really, really fulfilling way to live your day. So I think there's lots of very simple work. And again, this isn't work that we sat in the OD team and conjured up. We worked in workshops and we got them to do the work. You know, tell us what it is that you do that helps you make the nation healthy every day. And then people started being really creative about what it is that they do. And that is really motivating.
And I think that's it. Workshops is probably the last thing for us to talk about. You don't necessarily need to do lots of different technical surveys and spend loads of money on this stuff. Doing a workshop, having conversations with people and getting the ideas off them, because they are more bought in if they feel like they've contributed. You know, we do that here. We did a big workshop at the beginning of the year to go, right, this is where we need to be, but individually, what can each one of you do to help us get there? Mm-hmm. What's your part in that journey? Because it all links together, it's all cogs in a wheel. You know, so they all then went, oh well, if I do this and that person does that and you do that, that gets us here. And it's like, yeah, brilliant. And it's knowing that, like you say, that kind of the data entry bit is as vitally as important as the person at the top of the chain, and so that they know that. But we do it every month now. We have like a month end workshop where we talk about what's gone on that month, what the plans for the next month are, and what ideas do people have of, can we do this differently? What are your thoughts around, are we doing that okay? Or how can we, you know, and it's getting their thoughts. And it might be that you go, that's a great idea, we can't do it yet. And it's not about employee engagement. It's actually us just doing our jobs in terms of the day-to-day kind of context around it. But it really does make a difference. And, you know, being a small business, talking and having open and honest and transparent conversations, as opposed to me doing like an employee engagement survey, that makes more of a difference, because we do group workshops, we do individual one-to-ones, we all have these conversations, but actually the more you invite honest conversations, the more they happen. You know, it's one thing saying to somebody on the first day, if you need me, you can come and tell me anything, and then not doing that again, because they won't. But if you say to them all the time, look, tell me how you feel honestly, what, you know, like you say, ask the right questions and invite honest feedback, and do it all the time. And then they get used to going, oh, okay, so it's okay to be honest here, because they might have never had that before.
Yeah. That psychological safety, you know, if any member of my team came and said something to me that was marginally uncomfortable to hear, I would take that as a huge win, because for me, the only way that they've got to my ear is through psychological safety around the environment that you've created through, like you say, workshops is a great mechanism to be able to get them, invite them into solutionizing. You know, you all know what your outcomes are, but you can be really creative. And, you know, psychological safety and trust sit hand in hand with creativity and innovation. You can't have one without the other. And I think once you start to empower your team to know that they can contribute, they'll want to do more and more of it. And then coming back to what we talked about right at the beginning about that leadership piece around capacity, you know, knowing people have got some level of autonomy in their roles, again, is super fulfilling, but also means as a manager, you kind of not having to shoulder 16,000 plates. You know, you've said you have got the autonomy to make that decision. I trust you with it because I know that you'll make the right decision. If things go wrong, we'll learn from it. We'll fail fast. We'll learn. We'll move on. And I think, you know, it all comes back to that whole system thinking around how to lead your teams effectively.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we could talk about this all day.
Oh my goodness.
And we absolutely do all the time, every time I see you. So, you know, I think it's been great for us to do this session today. And I think there's some really key nuggets of information that we've covered here about OD, job design, We've looked at kind of culture and sort of change management. We've looked at kind of that manager burnout, and investing in your managers, and like we say, that job design, looking at their job and can they manage and do their job. Their capacity to manage a team. We've looked at that growth in leadership, and you very nicely kind of talked about the power of three when we're asking questions about employee engagement and things. So there's so much in here for people to kind of take some really good, strong nuggets of advice and guidance to take away. If they want to contact you, obviously you are on LinkedIn, so anybody can get in touch with you separately. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time today, Naomi. It has been an absolute pleasure as always.
Thank you for having me. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, no, like I say, we could probably do this all day, every day, but yeah, we do need to hold it there. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Kelly.